one boy destroyed an entire galaxy. Not with an army, not with a weapon, with patience. He smiled while he planned it. He waited decades. He let other people start the wars, fight the wars, and die in the wars, while he stood in the background, looking harmless. By the time anyone understood what he truly was, the Republic was gone. The Jedi were gone. An entire galaxy had quietly been rearranged around a lie he started building as a child. Here is his entire story, beginning to end. How an unremarkable boy became the most dangerous being the galaxy had ever known. How he tricked billions into handing him everything they had. And how, after every betrayal, every war, every empire he built with his own two hands, the one thing he could never fully conquer was the thing he feared most. We start at the very beginning. On a quiet green world, nobody suspected would one day produce a monster. He was simply a boy on a green and gentle world. A place so far removed from the machinery of galactic power that no one watching him grow up could have imagined what he would one day become. Naboo was known for its rolling plains, its underwater cities, its art and its calm. It was not a world that produced monsters, and yet it produced the greatest monster the galaxy would ever know. He was born into a family of minor nobility, comfortable but not extraordinary, the kind of household that valued appearances, tradition, and the slow, patient climb toward respectability. From the outside, nothing about his childhood suggested the horror that lay beneath the surface, but those closest to him sensed something different in the boy, almost from the beginning. He was quiet in a way that unsettled people. He watched more than he spoke. He listened to conversations he was never meant to hear, and he remembered every detail, filing it away for later use, even as a child. He understood that knowledge was power long before he understood anything about the force that flowed through him. That power was there from his earliest years, hidden and unrefined. But present, he did not yet have a name for it. He only knew that he could sense the moods of those around him before they spoke, that he could nudge a conversation in the direction he wanted, with nothing more than a carefully chosen phrase and a look that lingered just a moment too long. He was, even then, a manipulator by nature, someone who understood instinctively that the people around him were pieces to be arranged rather than individuals to be respected. His household was not a happy one. There was cruelty in it, tension simmering beneath a veneer of aristocratic manners, and the boy absorbed all of it, learning early that affection could be a tool and that fear could be even more useful. It was during these early years that he came to the attention of someone far more dangerous than anyone in his family ever suspected. Hidden within the galaxy's financial institutions, operating behind a mask of banking respectability, there existed a Sith Lord of extraordinary intellect and ambition, a member of a long-lived species whose calculating mind had turned toward the deepest mysteries of the Force itself. This Sith Lord had spent decades manipulating economies, currencies, and trade routes, all while conducting private experiments into the very fabric of life and death, searching for nothing less than a way to conquer mortality. He was the latest in an unbroken chain of Dark Lords stretching back 1,000 years, heirs to a philosophy that had been driven into hiding after a war that nearly annihilated the Sith entirely. Forced by circumstance to adopt a doctrine of secrecy, patience, and the rule that only two of their kind could exist at any one time: a master to embody power and an apprentice to crave it. This Sith Lord had spent years searching for a suitable heir, someone whose potential in the Force was matched by a hunger sharp enough to be shaped into something truly dangerous. He had traveled to countless worlds, evaluated countless candidates, and found most of them wanting. Raw power alone was not enough. He needed someone with the temperament to endure a lifetime of deception. Someone patient enough to wait decades for the right moment to strike, and someone cruel enough to do what needed to be done without hesitation. When his search brought him to Naboo, and his senses fell upon the young boy from the minor noble family, he recognized immediately that he had found what he was looking for. The boy's connection to the Force was not the strongest he had ever encountered, but it was more than sufficient, and paired with the coldness already visible in his young eyes, it suggested a mind uniquely suited to the Sith path. The old Sith Lord did not reveal himself all at once. He approached slowly, carefully, the way a predator studies its prey before striking, ensuring that every step forward was calculated to avoid detection by the Jedi Order, whose network of sensitives might have picked up on a disturbance if he moved too quickly or too clumsily. He appeared in the boy's life not as a sinister figure, but as a mentor, a guide, someone who understood the boy's frustrations with his family and his world in a way no one else seemed to. He offered knowledge. He offered validation. He offered the promise that the boy's abilities, dismissed or ignored by everyone else in his life, were in fact the mark of someone destined for greatness. For a young man who had spent his childhood feeling unseen and underestimated, this attention was intoxicating. Over months and then years, the relationship deepened. The old Sith taught his young protege in secret, introducing him gradually to the philosophy of the dark side, framing it not as evil but as truth, the honest acknowledgement that the galaxy ran on power and that those who denied their ambition were merely lying to themselves. He taught him to mask his growing abilities from any Jedi who might sense them, to project calm and harmlessness even as his connection to the Force deepened and darkened. He taught him the value of patience, explaining that the greatest victories were rarely won through brute force, but through decades of careful positioning, the slow accumulation of leverage until an entire system could be toppled with a single, well-timed push. But teaching was not enough. The Sith tradition demanded proof, a demonstration that the student had truly severed himself from the ties of ordinary morality and was ready to embrace the absolute ruthlessness the path required. And so, under his master's guidance, the young man was made to prove his commitment in the most horrifying way imaginable. He turned against his own family, the household that had raised him, the parents and relatives who had shaped his early life, and he destroyed them utterly. It was not an act of passion or rage. It was calculated, deliberate, and cold, carried out with the same detachment he would later bring to the destruction of entire star systems. In that single act, whatever remained of the boy from Naboo was extinguished, and something else took his place. Something that wore the same face, but no longer possessed anything resembling a conscience. His master was satisfied. The trial had been passed, and the boy was formally inducted into the ancient and secret tradition of the Sith, given a new name to mark his transformation, a title that stripped away his old identity entirely and replaced it with something darker. From that point forward, in the shadows where his master operated and in the hidden rituals they performed together, He was no longer the person his family had once known. He was a Dark Lord in training, an apprentice bound to a master who intended to use him as the final instrument in a plan that had been unfolding for a millennium. That plan was as audacious as it was patient. Generations of Sith Lords, each one training a single successor before passing into the Force or being struck down by that very successor, had worked in secret to prepare for the day when the Sith would finally return to power and destroy the Jedi Order that had hunted them into hiding. Each master added new pieces to a strategy that spanned centuries, and by the time it reached the moon-featured financier and his young apprentice from Naboo, the plan had matured into something extraordinarily specific. The galaxy's political and economic systems would be manipulated from within until they became so bloated, so corrupt, and so paralyzed by bureaucracy that eventually a single figure could seize total control and have the exhausted population welcome that control as a relief, rather than resist it as a conquest. While his master continued to work through the banking clans and financial institutions, manipulating currencies and trade agreements to sow discord and inefficiency throughout the wider galaxy, the young apprentice was given a different assignment. He would enter politics. He would return, at least outwardly, to the world of his birth, and begin the long, slow climb through its planetary government before eventually setting his sights on the Galactic Senate itself. It was an assignment that suited his particular talents perfectly. Where his master preferred the anonymity of boardrooms and shell corporations, the apprentice thrived on personal interaction, on reading a room and calculating exactly what each person in it wanted to hear. He built his early political career on charm and apparent sincerity, cultivating a reputation as a reasonable, thoughtful, unassuming public servant. Someone who listened more than he spoke, and who seemed genuinely interested in the well-being of his constituents. Beneath that carefully constructed surface, he was learning to weaponize every tool available to him. He studied the mechanics of governance not to serve them but to exploit them, identifying every loophole, every procedural weakness, every place where ambiguity could be turned into opportunity. He cultivated relationships with people who could be useful to him later, storing away favors and secrets the way a miser hoards credits, never using them until the moment was right. He learned to speak in ways that meant different things to different listeners, crafting statements that satisfied idealists and cynics alike, without ever committing himself to anything that could later be used against him. It was, in its own dark way, a masterclass in patience and restraint, all the more remarkable because it was performed by a young man who, in private, was being trained in rituals of the dark side that would have horrified anyone who thought they knew him. For decades, master and apprentice worked in careful tandem, their partnership growing more sophisticated and more dangerous with each passing year. The master continued to expand his influence through galactic finance, manipulating the flow of credits and resources to create artificial crises that could later be exploited, all while conducting his private research into life, death, and the deeper secrets of the Force in the isolation of his hidden laboratories. He believed, with the singular obsession of a scientist who has glimpsed something no one else has ever seen, that he could master the very forces of creation itself, that he could learn to prevent death entirely, and perhaps even learn to will life into being through sheer control of the microscopic organisms that connected all living things to the Force. It was an obsession that consumed more and more of his time and attention, drawing him further from the political machinations his apprentice was carrying out in his name. The apprentice, meanwhile, rose steadily. He became a senator, representing his homeworld in the galaxy's central legislative body. And from that position, he had access to a much larger stage on which to practice the patient and methodical manipulation his master had taught him. He watched the Republic's government from the inside, and what he saw confirmed everything his master had told him about the rot at its core. The Senate was slow, self-interested, and hopelessly divided. Its members more concerned with securing advantages for their homeworlds than with governing the galaxy as a whole. Trade disputes lingered for years without resolution. Corporate entities like the various trade federations and commerce guilds wielded influence that rivaled entire star systems, buying political favor and manipulating markets with almost no oversight. The apprentice saw all of this not as a problem to be solved, but as a resource to be mined. Every dysfunction in the system was an opportunity waiting to be exploited by someone patient and ruthless enough to seize it. He did not rush. Where a lesser conspirator might have tried to force his way to power through violence or open corruption, he understood that the surest path was to become indispensable, to make himself appear to be the only reasonable, competent figure in an institution defined by incompetence and self-interest. He positioned himself as a moderate, a peacemaker, someone above the petty squabbles of factional politics, all while secretly funding and manipulating both sides of every dispute that mattered to his long-term plans. He cultivated allies who had no idea they were being used, friendships that would later prove instrumental in his rise, and enemies whose downfall he engineered so carefully that they never suspected his involvement. There were moments during this long apprenticeship when the two Sith Lords conducted secret rituals together, dark side rites performed in the heart of the Republic's capital, powerful enough that even the distant Jedi Order, complacent after generations of unchallenged peace, felt a disturbance ripple through the Force. But the disturbance was fleeting and unfocused, impossible to trace to its source, and the Jedi, secure in their belief that the Sith had been extinct for 1,000 years, dismissed it as an anomaly rather than a warning. That complacency would prove to be one of the greatest strategic advantages the two Sith Lords ever possessed. An order trained to sense danger had convinced itself that the danger it was trained to sense no longer existed, and that blind spot allowed the conspiracy to operate for decades directly beneath the noses of the very people sworn to stop it. As the years passed, the balance between master and apprentice began to shift in ways the master did not fully appreciate. The apprentice had absorbed everything his teacher had to offer, not only the political and philosophical lessons, but the deeper, more esoteric knowledge of Sith history, ritual, and the manipulation of the Force that his master had spent a lifetime accumulating. He had learned to see through people, to sense weakness and exploit it, to project an aura of calm reasonableness that concealed a will of iron beneath. And crucially, he had begun to see his master's flaws with a clarity his master could not see in himself. Where the old Sith had become consumed by his research into immortality, retreating further into private study and away from the day-to-day work of political conquest, the apprentice recognized that true power lay not in the pursuit of eternal life, but in the total, unchallenged domination of everyone and everything around him. He had no interest in sharing that domination, not even with the Master who had made him what he was. The philosophy of the Sith itself all but guaranteed this outcome. The rule that bound them, master and apprentice, ensured that only the strongest could survive, and it was understood, even if never spoken aloud, that the apprentice was meant to eventually surpass and replace the master. It was not treachery in the traditional sense. It was simply the mechanism by which the Sith had ensured their evolution and their survival across 1,000 years of secrecy. Each new master forged in the fire of betraying the one who trained them. The apprentice had known this from the very beginning of his training, had understood on some level that the day would come when he would need to strike, and as his own power grew, and his master's attention drifted further into his private obsessions, that day drew steadily closer. The final betrayal was carried out with the same cold precision that had defined everything else in the apprentice's life. There was no dramatic confrontation, no desperate struggle between equals. The master, brilliant as he was in matters of finance and force philosophy, had grown complacent in his own laboratory, secure in the belief that his apprentice remained loyal and that his research was too valuable to be interrupted. He had, in his arrogance, failed to recognize that the greatest threat to a Sith Lord rarely comes from some external enemy. It comes from the very apprentice trained to eventually take his place. The apprentice struck while his master was vulnerable, ending the partnership that had defined both of their lives and claiming for himself, at last, the undivided title of Dark Lord of the Sith. Whatever knowledge his master had failed to pass on, whatever secrets remained locked away in old research logs and hidden laboratories, would have to remain lost because the master who might have shared them was gone, and the apprentice who inherited his legacy had no interest in looking back. He was, from that point forward, answerable to no one. Decades of patient political maneuvering in the Senate had already built him a formidable base of influence, and now, with the constraints of his old partnership removed, he was free to accelerate the final phase of a plan that had been unfolding, in one form or another, for 1,000 years. He understood that the Republic could not simply be conquered through force. Its institutions were too entrenched, its population too large and too dispersed, and any attempt at open military conquest would almost certainly draw the full attention of the Jedi Order before it could succeed. The only path to total power was through the Republic's own systems, through its Senate, its courts, its economy, all of it turned inside out and used against itself until the citizens of the galaxy begged for the very authority that would ultimately enslave them. The opportunity he needed arrived from an unexpected direction: his own homeworld. Naboo, the peaceful, unassuming planet of his birth, became the stage for a crisis he engineered with a precision that revealed just how far his ambitions had progressed. Using his considerable influence over one of the galaxy's largest and most powerful commercial entities, he orchestrated a blockade and eventual invasion of his own world, plunging its peaceful population into a war they never saw coming. It was a staggering, almost incomprehensible betrayal. A man willing to subject the world of his birth to occupation and suffering purely to advance his own political position, but it achieved precisely what he intended. The crisis exposed the Republic Senate's paralysis to the entire galaxy, showing millions of citizens across countless systems just how helpless their government truly was in the face of a real emergency. It created outrage, and outrage created the perfect conditions for a vote of no confidence against the sitting head of state, a leader whose failure to respond to the crisis on Naboo became a symbol of everything wrong with the Republic's aging political structure. Standing at the center of it all, appearing to the galaxy as a victim of the crisis rather than its architect, he presented himself as exactly the kind of leader the Republic needed: calm under pressure, personally affected by the tragedy, and free of the entrenched interests that had paralyzed the Senate for so long. When the vote came, he was swept into the highest office in the Republic on a wave of sympathy and desperation for change. Elected by senators who believed they were choosing a reformer, never suspecting they had just handed absolute trust to the very architect of the crisis that put him there. It was, in every sense, the culmination of decades of planning, the moment when secret Sith apprentice and public political figure finally merged into a single, terrifyingly effective identity. Once in office, he did not rush to seize dictatorial power outright. That would have been the mistake of a lesser strategist, someone who mistook opportunity for inevitability. Instead, he governed, at least outwardly, as a careful, moderate reformer, someone determined to root out corruption and inefficiency wherever he found it. Behind that public performance, he worked tirelessly and invisibly to consolidate his personal authority, placing loyalists in key positions, quietly expanding the powers of his own office under the guise of emergency reforms, and ensuring that every crisis the galaxy faced, whether by coincidence or, more often, by his own hidden design, could be used to justify granting him just a little more authority than the office had previously held. He was patient in a way that no ordinary politician could sustain, understanding that real transformation of an entire galactic government could not be accomplished in a single term or even a single decade. It would take the systematic unraveling of an entire era of peace, engineered so carefully that the galaxy itself would beg him to save it from a catastrophe he alone had set into motion. That catastrophe arrived in the form of a war unlike anything the galaxy had seen in 1,000 years. A conflict he did not merely allow to happen, but actively designed from its very first spark to its final resolution. Behind the scenes, using an identity entirely separate from his public role as head of the Republic, he cultivated a fallen Jedi Master, a brilliant, disillusioned aristocrat who had grown to despise the corruption of the Senate and the complacency of the Jedi Order he once served. This former Jedi became his second apprentice, trained not in the same intimate, decades-long apprenticeship that had shaped the Dark Lord himself, but quickly and pragmatically groomed to serve a specific and limited purpose: to build an army, gather disaffected systems into a secessionist movement, and provide the galaxy with an external threat, terrifying enough to justify whatever military response the Dark Lord decided was necessary. It worked exactly as intended. Thousands of star systems, disillusioned by years of Senate corruption and inspired by the fallen Jedi's rhetoric about restoring order and eliminating the bureaucratic rot, seceded from the Republic and formed their own confederation, assembling a droid army of staggering size under the direction of commercial and industrial partners who had their own reasons for wanting the Republic weakened. On the other side of the conflict, using the very Senate powers he had spent years quietly accumulating, the Dark Lord secured emergency authority to commission an army of his own, a vast force of clone soldiers that had, in fact, been secretly ordered into production years before the war even began, grown in secret on a remote world under the direction of people who believed they were simply fulfilling an old, legitimate military contract. The genius and the horror of the entire scheme was that he controlled both sides. The war that would come to consume the galaxy for years, claiming countless lives and reshaping the political landscape of 1,000 worlds, was not a conflict between two opposing ideologies, but a single, elaborate performance staged entirely for his benefit. Every battle, every tragic loss, every desperate act of heroism by soldiers and Jedi generals who believed they were fighting to preserve the Republic served only to further his own accumulation of power. As the war dragged on, the Senate, gripped by fear and eager for strong leadership in a time of crisis, granted him ever greater emergency powers, transforming his office from a checked and balanced position into something closer to outright military command. He accepted each new grant of authority with public reluctance and private satisfaction, always careful to appear as though he were a burdened public servant, reluctantly shouldering responsibilities he never wanted, rather than a conspirator harvesting exactly the authority he had spent a lifetime planning to seize. Throughout the long years of that war, he also turned his attention to a young Jedi whose extraordinary potential in the Force had become the subject of both hope and anxiety within the Jedi Order. This young man had been discovered on a remote desert world as a child, brought into the Jedi Order later than was traditional, and had grown into one of the most powerful and gifted Jedi Knights in generations, celebrated for his skill in battle and his compassion for those under his protection, but also privately tormented by fears of loss, by a desperate need to protect the people he loved, and by a growing frustration with an order that he felt did not fully trust him or appreciate his sacrifices. The Dark Lord recognized in this young Jedi exactly the kind of vulnerability that could be exploited over time. And so, using the trusted, grandfatherly persona he had cultivated as head of state, he began quietly cultivating a friendship with him, offering sympathy and understanding in moments when the Jedi Council offered only discipline and caution. It was a seduction carried out patiently, over years, built on small kindnesses and careful validation rather than any single dramatic moment. He listened to the young Jedi's fears when others dismissed them. He offered forbidden knowledge about the nature of life and death, when the boy's greatest terror, the possibility of losing someone he loved, became too much to bear. He planted doubts about the Jedi Council's wisdom and motives, framing their caution as jealousy and their rules as chains meant to keep the young man from reaching his full potential. Every conversation was a small step in a much larger design, each one calculated to widen the gap between the young Jedi and the Order he had sworn to serve, until eventually that gap became unbridgeable, and the fear and desperation that had been so carefully nurtured over years finally erupted into a single catastrophic choice. When the moment came, it came quickly. Grief and desperation drove the young Jedi to embrace exactly the path the Dark Lord had spent years preparing for him. And in that instant, decades of careful manipulation reached their terrible culmination. The war that had consumed the galaxy for so long was engineered to end at precisely this moment. Its usefulness exhausted the instant the young Jedi's fall was secured. With his new apprentice now bound to him, the Dark Lord revealed his true nature to the wider galaxy in a single devastating stroke, activating a hidden directive buried within the minds of every cloned soldier serving in the Republic's military. A secret command that turned the army meant to protect the Jedi into the instrument of their annihilation. Across 1,000 worlds, in a single coordinated moment, Jedi generals who had led those clone soldiers through years of brutal war were cut down by the very troops who had once called them friends and commanders, betrayed by a program embedded so deeply and so quietly that none of them had ever suspected it existed. The devastation was immediate and almost total. An order that had endured for 1,000 generations, that had weathered wars and betrayals and internal strife across the long centuries of the Republic's history, was brought to the edge of extinction in a matter of days. Its members hunted across the galaxy by the very soldiers they had led into battle. Its temples burned, its archives seized, its remaining survivors forced into hiding or death. The Dark Lord, standing before the assembled Senate in the aftermath of this carefully orchestrated catastrophe, framed the destruction of the Jedi as the unmasking of a conspiracy against the Republic itself, presenting himself once again not as the architect of the tragedy, but as its reluctant, grieving witness, a leader forced by circumstance to take on emergency powers to protect the galaxy from enemies within. The Senate, exhausted by years of war and terrified by the supposed revelation of a Jedi conspiracy, offered him almost no resistance. What had begun as a temporary grant of emergency authority was transformed, with the Senate's own overwhelming approval, into something permanent and absolute. The Republic that had stood for 1,000 years. The democratic institution that generations of senators, soldiers, and ordinary citizens had believed in and sacrificed for, was declared reorganized into a new galactic order, one built not around representation and debate, but around the singular, unchecked authority of the very figure who had spent his entire life engineering its downfall from within. The thunderous applause that greeted this announcement in the Senate chamber was, in its own way, the final and most devastating proof of just how completely his decades of patient manipulation had succeeded. An entire galaxy, exhausted and afraid, had willingly traded its freedom for the illusion of safety, never realizing that the very figure offering them protection was the one who had spent a lifetime engineering the danger in the first place. The transformation of the Republic into a new galactic order was not the end of his work, but merely the beginning of its next phase. And he pursued the consolidation of his new empire with the same patient, methodical cruelty that had defined every step of his rise. The Senate, though nominally still in session, was quietly stripped of any meaningful power. Its debates reduced to theater, performed for a galaxy still adjusting to the shock of what had happened. Where once 1,000 competing voices had argued and negotiated and occasionally accomplished something through compromise, now there was only the appearance of governance, a hollow ritual maintained purely to give the illusion of continuity, while every actual decision flowed from a single throne. Regional governors loyal to him personally, rather than to any office or institution, were installed across the galaxy to oversee entire sectors, answerable only to him, and given sweeping authority to enforce order through whatever means they judged necessary. Local systems that had once sent representatives to debate policy on equal footing with their neighbors found themselves instead receiving directives, their old governments reduced to administrative formalities beneath a new military and bureaucratic hierarchy designed for one purpose alone, the perpetuation of his personal rule. He understood, perhaps better than any tyrant before him, that fear was a far more efficient tool of governance than genuine loyalty, and he set about institutionalizing that fear on a scale the galaxy had never witnessed. Military production, disguised for years under the cover of defending the Republic during its long war, was redirected entirely toward the construction of instruments of terror chief among them, a battle station of almost unimaginable size and destructive power, capable of annihilating an entire world in a single strike. The project had, in truth, been decades in the planning, its earliest designs conceived long before the war that provided the perfect cover for its construction, another testament to just how far in advance his schemes had always operated. He did not intend to use this weapon indiscriminately. Its value lay not merely in its capacity for destruction, but in the psychological weight of its mere existence. A constant, silent reminder to every system in the galaxy that defiance carried a price beyond anything they could imagine. Alongside the machinery of physical terror, he built an apparatus of ideological and informational control every bit as ruthless. History was rewritten to erase the truth of what had happened to the Jedi, replacing their sacrifice and betrayal with a fabricated narrative of treachery and attempted coup, a story repeated so often and so consistently across every world under his control that within a single generation, most citizens of the galaxy would come to accept it as simple, unquestioned fact. Children were taught in schools, funded and overseen by his new government, that the Jedi had been a corrupt and power-hungry cabal, secretly plotting to seize control of the Republic for themselves, and that the heroic intervention of loyal soldiers and a wise, self-sacrificing leader had saved the galaxy from their conspiracy just in time. It was one of the most audacious inversions of truth in galactic history, turning the victims of his conspiracy into its supposed perpetrators. And he achieved it not through any single dramatic act of propaganda, but through decades of patient, incremental control over information, exactly the same methodology he had used to seize political power in the first place. His new apprentice, the fallen Jedi, now transformed into something almost more machine than man, after the injuries he suffered in the final confrontation that sealed his descent into darkness, became the visible, terrifying instrument of his will across the galaxy. Clad in black armor that concealed a body ravaged by fire and betrayal, this apprentice was dispatched to crush any lingering resistance, to hunt the scattered survivors of the Jedi Purge, and to enforce obedience among governors, military officers, and local administrators who might otherwise have been tempted to test the limits of the new order's authority. The relationship between master and apprentice in this new phase of the plan mirrored, in its coldness, the relationship the Dark Lord had once shared with his own master decades earlier, though inverted in its cruelty, where his old master had cultivated him with patience and something that almost resembled genuine investment in his development. The Dark Lord treated his new servant as a tool to be used, punished, and discarded the moment his usefulness expired, keeping him perpetually off balance through casual displays of pain delivered at the smallest provocation, ensuring that fear, rather than loyalty or shared purpose, remained the foundation of their bond. Beneath this apprentice, an entire order of dark side hunters was assembled, drawing on individuals sensitive to the Force who could be trained quickly and brutally to track down the handful of Jedi who had managed to survive the initial purge and vanish into hiding across the galaxy's more remote corners. These hunters combed through old Jedi records, followed rumors and half-remembered sightings, and interrogated anyone suspected of harboring fugitives from the old order, slowly but relentlessly narrowing the number of Jedi still alive in the galaxy with each passing year. It was methodical, patient work, exactly the kind of long-term project the Dark Lord favored, understanding that a single dramatic campaign to eliminate the Jedi all at once would have been far less effective than a slow, grinding pursuit that kept the survivors perpetually isolated terrified and unable to organize any kind of coordinated resistance. For the ordinary citizens of the galaxy, the early years of this new order brought a strange and unsettling mixture of stability and dread. Trade routes that had been disrupted by years of war were reopened. Infrastructure projects promised to bring prosperity to systems that had suffered under the chaos of the previous decades. For those willing to keep their heads down, avoid drawing attention, and accept the loss of political voice in exchange for order and predictability, life under the new regime could appear, on the surface, almost tolerable. But beneath that surface calm, an entire apparatus of surveillance and suppression worked ceaselessly to identify and eliminate any hint of dissent before it could grow into something dangerous. Informants were rewarded. Free expression, particularly anything that touched on the fate of the old Jedi Order, or questioned the official narrative of the Republic's fall, was ruthlessly punished. Entire species and cultures that had enjoyed representation and protection under the old Senate found themselves marginalized or persecuted under a government that increasingly favored a narrow, centralized vision of galactic order over the diversity that had once defined the Republic at its best. He ruled from the same city world that had once housed the heart of the Republic's government, transforming its grand halls of debate and diplomacy into the seat of an empire built entirely around his singular will. Visitors to his throne room, when they were granted an audience at all, described an atmosphere heavy with something they could not quite name, a pervasive sense of dread that seemed to emanate from the figure seated at its center, a man whose public persona as an elderly, mild-mannered statesman had by this point almost entirely dissolved, revealing beneath it something twisted and inhuman, his features slowly transformed by decades of unrestrained use of the darkest aspects of the Force into something that barely resembled the ambitious young politician who had once charmed his way through the corridors of the old Senate. He seemed, to those who encountered him directly, less like a man who wielded power and more like power itself, given a terrible, patient shape. And yet, even at the height of his authority, with an entire galaxy bent beneath his will and an apprentice enforcing his rule with fear and violence, he remained as cautious and calculating as he had been in his earliest days as a hidden Sith trainee. He never fully trusted his own success, understanding with the clarity of someone who had spent his entire life exploiting the weaknesses of others that his empire, built on deception and fear rather than genuine loyalty, carried within it the seeds of its own potential unraveling. He watched constantly for signs of rebellion, for sparks of resistance among the systems he governed, for any indication that the fear holding his empire together might begin to weaken. He was not wrong to worry. Even as his forces hunted down the last remnants of the old Jedi Order, and his propaganda machine worked to erase the truth of the Republic's fall from the galaxy's collective memory, small pockets of resistance were beginning to form in the shadows, fed by exactly the kind of desperation and outrage that had once fueled his own rise to power. A bitter irony that the very tactics he had used to seize control of the galaxy were now being turned, however tentatively, against him. Among the scattered survivors of the old Jedi Order, a handful of the most skilled and most determined refused to simply vanish into hiding and wait for death. Some chose exile on remote, forgotten worlds, watching from a distance as the empire they had failed to prevent tightened its grip on the galaxy, biding their time in the hope that some future opportunity might allow them to undo, even partially, the catastrophe of their order's destruction. Others chose a more dangerous path, working quietly within the underground currents of resistance beginning to stir among disaffected senators, disillusioned military officers, and ordinary citizens who had grown weary of life under an increasingly repressive regime. It was slow, fragile, and desperately dangerous work, conducted always under the shadow of discovery, knowing that any misstep could bring the full weight of the Empire's dark side enforcers down upon them. The Dark Lord, for his part, remained supremely confident that no threat to his rule could ever truly succeed. He had spent his entire life outmaneuvering people who believed themselves clever, patient, and prepared. And he saw no reason to believe that the scattered remnants of a shattered order or the disorganized grumblings of a cowed populace could ever pose a genuine threat to an empire built on decades of careful planning and now backed by the single most destructive weapon the galaxy had ever seen. He allowed his apprentice to conduct the ongoing hunt for surviving Jedi with methodical patience rather than urgency, confident that time itself was his greatest ally, that every year that passed made his grip on the galaxy more permanent and the old republic he had destroyed more distant a memory. He had, after all, waited decades already, cultivating his rise to power with a patience that would have broken lesser conspirators, and he saw no reason why the consolidation of his empire should require any less discipline. It was this very confidence, born from a lifetime of successful manipulation, that would eventually prove to be his greatest vulnerability, though he could not have known it in those early years of his reign. Somewhere in the galaxy, hidden and protected by allies who understood exactly what was at stake, a piece of unfinished business from his own rise to power remained alive, a thread from his past that he believed had been permanently severed, but which had, in fact, only been driven into hiding, waiting for the moment when it would return to unravel everything he had built, the empire he had spent a lifetime constructing, an empire founded on betrayal, secrecy, and the systematic destruction of everyone who might have stood against him, carried within its very foundation the one thing his decades of careful planning had never fully accounted for: the possibility that the family he believed he had erased from existence might not be as gone as he assumed. By the time his great battle station neared completion, the galaxy he ruled had settled into an uneasy, watchful, quiet, the kind of silence that exists not because conflict has ended, but because it has been driven underground, waiting for the right spark to bring it roaring back into the open. He spent these years rarely leaving the seat of his power, preferring to govern from a distance, allowing his regional governors, his admirals, and his black armored enforcer to carry out the day-to-day business of maintaining order, while he devoted himself to matters he trusted no one else to handle. Chief among these was his own continued study of the darker, more esoteric dimensions of the Force, disciplines that had fascinated him since his earliest days as a secret apprentice, and that he had never fully abandoned, even as the demands of empire consumed more and more of his attention. He believed, as his old master once had, that ultimate power required transcending the ordinary limitations of mortality itself, and in private, hidden even from those closest to him, he continued to pursue knowledge that few in galactic history had ever dared to seek. He was, by every account from those who served closest to him, a figure of contradictions. In public appearances, when he chose to make them, he could still summon something of the calm, avuncular charm that had carried him through decades of political maneuvering. addressing crowds and dignitaries with a warmth that seemed almost sincere despite everything the galaxy now knew or suspected about the true nature of his rule. In private, that warmth vanished entirely, replaced by something colder and infinitely more dangerous, a will that brooked no dissent and a temper that, when provoked, could express itself through the same casual, devastating use of dark side power that kept his apprentice in a permanent state of controlled fear. Those who worked closely with him learned quickly that his moods could shift without warning, that a moment of apparent calm could give way instantly to a burst of violence delivered through the Force itself, a lesson learned by more than one ambitious officer or overconfident advisor who mistook his outward composure for weakness. He surrounded himself with layers of protection, both physical and political, understanding better than anyone the ease with which power could be seized by someone patient and ruthless enough, since he himself was living proof of exactly that possibility. Elite soldiers guarded his person at all times. His most trusted officers were carefully selected, not merely for competence, but for a demonstrated lack of the kind of independent ambition that might one day turn against him. He kept even his closest allies compartmentalized, ensuring that no single subordinate, not even his own apprentice, ever possessed complete knowledge of his plans or complete control over the instruments of his power. It was the same philosophy of divided, controlled information that had served him so well during his decades of political scheming in the Senate, now applied on a galactic scale to the administration of an empire built entirely around the perpetuation of his personal authority. Despite these precautions, the pressures building beneath the surface of his empire continued to grow. The economic burden of constructing and maintaining a military machine of unprecedented scale, including the almost incomprehensible resources poured into his great battle station, fell disproportionately on systems and populations that had little say in how those resources were spent. Resentment simmered in outer rim territories that saw only the harsh hand of occupation and taxation without any of the promised benefits of order and stability. Former officers of the old Republic military, disillusioned by the transformation of an institution they had once served with pride into an instrument of naked oppression, quietly began reaching out to one another, forming the earliest networks of what would eventually become organized, armed resistance. Even within the ranks of his own government, whispers of discontent occasionally surfaced among administrators and officers who had joined his new order, believing in its promise of stability and efficiency, only to find themselves enforcing policies of increasing brutality against populations that had done nothing to deserve it. He was aware, in broad terms, of this growing unrest, and he treated it with the same combination of patience and calculated ruthlessness that had defined his entire life. Rather than attempting to suppress every isolated act of dissent the moment it appeared, he allowed a certain amount of resistance to persist, understanding that visible, containable opposition served a useful purpose, giving his security forces a justification for expanding surveillance and giving the wider populace a tangible enemy to fear, an enemy whose activities could be blamed for hardships that were, in truth, largely the product of his own policies. It was a strategy built on the same fundamental insight that had guided him since his earliest days, manipulating the Republic Senate. That a population kept slightly afraid and slightly divided was far easier to control than one that felt either fully secure or fully unified in its grievances. Yet even his prodigious capacity for patience and manipulation could not entirely account for every variable, and the galaxy, vast and unpredictable as it was, continued to hold surprises even for a mind as calculating as his. On a remote, sun-baked world at the very edge of civilized space, a young man was growing up in circumstances that seemed, on the surface, entirely unremarkable, raised by moisture farmers far from the political intrigues of the capital. Dreaming of adventures beyond the horizon of his desert home, with no knowledge whatsoever of the role fate, or perhaps the Force itself, had already begun weaving for him. The Dark Lord, for all his careful planning and his belief that he had accounted for every threat to his rule, remained entirely unaware of this young man's existence, a blind spot in an otherwise formidable web of surveillance and control. One that would, in time, prove far more consequential than any of the scattered rebellions or disillusioned officers currently occupying his attention. The completion of his great battle station marked, in his own mind, the definitive end of any real possibility of organized resistance succeeding against his rule. He had spent a lifetime building toward absolute power, and now he possessed not merely political dominance over the galaxy's institutions, but a weapon capable of erasing any world that dared to defy him, a deterrent so absolute that he believed it would finally silence even the most stubborn pockets of rebellion scattered across the outer territories. He allowed himself, in these years, something he had rarely permitted throughout his long and calculated rise, a measure of genuine satisfaction, the quiet confidence of a man who believed he had finally, truly won, that the empire he had spent his entire life engineering was now permanent, unassailable, and beyond any threat that the galaxy could still muster against him. It was, in hindsight, precisely the kind of overconfidence that had doomed every tyrant before him, though he would have dismissed the comparison with contempt had anyone dared suggest it to his face. He had, after all, succeeded where countless other Sith Lords across 1,000 years of patient scheming had failed, achieving in a single lifetime what generations of his predecessors had only dreamed of: total, unchallenged mastery over the galaxy itself. He did not yet know that the very galaxy he believed he had conquered still held within it the seeds of his undoing, a scattered handful of old allies, a hidden legacy from his own dark past, and a young man on a distant desert world whose connection to the Force, though he could not yet sense it, burned with a potential that would one day rival and ultimately help unravel everything he had built across a lifetime of betrayal, patience, and ruthless, calculated ambition. There is a peculiar irony in the way absolute power tends to blind those who hold it, and he was not immune to that blindness, no matter how carefully he had studied the failures of others across his long apprenticeship in the ways of manipulation and control. He had spent decades cultivating an image of himself as a figure above the petty ambitions and emotional weaknesses that doomed lesser men, a dark lord who ruled through cold calculation rather than passion, who never allowed sentiment to cloud his judgment the way it had clouded the judgment of every rival he had ever destroyed. And yet, in his treatment of his own apprentice, in the casual cruelty with which he dismissed the man's lingering humanity and buried grief beneath layers of fear and obedience, he was, without fully realizing it, cultivating exactly the kind of resentment that had once fueled his own betrayal of the master who made him. He believed his apprentice broken beyond any possibility of reclaiming what remained of the person he had once been, a tool shaped so thoroughly by pain and loss that no flicker of the old self could ever resurface to threaten the empire they had built together. It was, perhaps, the one true miscalculation in an otherwise flawless lifetime of manipulation. The assumption that total domination of another being's will could never, under any circumstances, be undone. For now, though, none of that uncertainty troubled the surface of his rule. He sat at the absolute center of galactic power, worshipped by some, feared by nearly all, and mourned by the handful who still remembered, in whispers passed carefully between trusted friends, the Republic and the Jedi Order. He had spent a lifetime dismantling piece by patient piece. The story of how he came to hold that power, from a quiet boy on a peaceful world to the architect of the galaxy's darkest era, was already, in his own mind, complete, a triumph without equal in the long and bloody history of the Sith. But history, as he would eventually learn, rarely allows even its most careful architects the luxury of a final word. And the chapters still waiting to be written, chapters involving a hidden son of the desert, a fallen apprentice, who had not been broken quite as thoroughly as believed, and a reckoning decades in the making would prove that even the most patient and calculating Dark Lord in 1,000 years of Sith history could not entirely escape the reach of his own past. And so the galaxy settled, for a time, into the uneasy peace of total subjugation. A peace held together not by consent or shared purpose, but by fear, propaganda, and the looming shadow of a weapon capable of erasing entire worlds. Somewhere far from the polished halls of the capital, hidden allies of a fallen republic kept faint hope alive, passing rumors of resistance from system to system like embers carried carefully through a long and bitter winter. And somewhere else entirely, unnoticed by the very mind that believed it had accounted for every threat, still standing between himself and eternal, unchallenged rule, the first true crack in his empire was already beginning to form, quiet and unremarkable, waiting only for the right moment to widen into something the Dark Lord of the Sith would never be able to fully contain. The crack began, as so many great unravelings do, with something small enough to seem insignificant at first glance. Deep within the bowels of his great battle station, buried among the countless technical schematics and structural blueprints that governed its construction, lay a flaw, a single vulnerable point, deliberately hidden by an engineer who had grown to despise the tyranny he was forced to serve. A man who understood that he could never openly resist the empire that commanded his skills, but who found, in the quiet architecture of his own designs, a way to plant a seed of hope for a rebellion he would likely never live to see succeed. That flaw, and the stolen plans that revealed its existence, found their way through a chain of desperate, frightened hands, smuggled across hostile space by agents of a resistance movement that had, by this point, grown from scattered pockets of disillusioned officers and grieving survivors into something resembling an organized, if still deeply outmatched, alliance against his rule. He did not yet know how close that vulnerability had come to reaching the eyes of people capable of exploiting it. He remained, in these final months before his complacency was shattered, utterly convinced that his great weapon represented an unassailable symbol of his empire's permanence, a deterrent so absolute that no rebellion, however determined, could hope to overcome it through anything but suicidal desperation. It was precisely this confidence, cultivated over decades of unbroken success, that blinded him to the growing danger, and it was his own apprentice, dispatched to hunt down the stolen plans and crush the resistance cell responsible for acquiring them, who unknowingly set in motion the first true test of the Empire's supposed invincibility. In the course of that pursuit, deep in the tangled political intrigue of a border world once ruled by a senator who had quietly become one of the Resistance's most valuable hidden allies, his apprentice discovered something far more significant than a set of stolen schematics. He discovered, through methods as ruthless as they were effective, evidence pointing toward a young woman who had inherited both the political conviction and, though neither man yet understood it, the bloodline of a fallen Jedi they had both believed long dead. She was captured, interrogated, and imprisoned aboard the very battle station whose secrets she had helped smuggle away, held as bait for a rescue attempt that her captors were confident would never come, never suspecting that this single decision, made almost as an afterthought amid the vast machinery of Imperial control, would set into motion the beginning of the end for everything the Dark Lord had spent a lifetime building. The rescue came from an unlikely combination of desperation and coincidence. A young farm boy from a remote desert world, restless with a longing for adventure he could never quite name, an old hermit living in exile at the edge of civilization who had once been counted among the most respected members of the fallen Jedi Order, and a droid carrying within its memory banks a desperate plea and the very technical plans that could bring down the Empire's greatest weapon. Neither the Dark Lord nor his apprentice paid the young man any particular attention when reports first filtered in describing his involvement in the rescue, dismissing him as an insignificant accomplice to a mission that, in the broader context of galactic power, seemed destined to end in failure regardless of its outcome. It was an oversight that would prove catastrophic, though its full consequences would not become clear for some time yet. The old hermit, however, was recognized instantly, and with a chill that even the Dark Lord's apprentice, trained for years to suppress emotion beneath layers of mechanical breath and armored control, could not entirely hide. It was the Jedi Master, who had once been counted among his oldest friends and fiercest rivals, a man he had believed dead for nearly 2 decades, hiding in plain sight at the edge of the very desert world where, unbeknownst to either of them at that moment, a boy carrying the bloodline of both men's history had been quietly raised in secrecy. Their confrontation aboard the battle station was brief, almost anticlimactic in its physical brutality. A duel between two masters whose true battle had always been philosophical rather than merely martial. The old Jedi allowed himself to be struck down, choosing in that final moment to become something more powerful than his physical body had ever allowed him to be, vanishing from the battlefield entirely and leaving behind nothing but an empty cloak and a mystery that would haunt his former student for years to come. The destruction of the great battle station that followed, brought about through a combination of the stolen plans, a single desperate flight down a heavily defended trench, and a moment of instinct that seemed to defy every rational calculation of probability, represented the single greatest blow to his authority since the earliest, most fragile days of his secret rise to power. He had staked an enormous portion of his empire's resources and, more importantly, an enormous portion of its psychological authority on the absolute invincibility of that weapon, and its destruction at the hands of a group of rebels he had dismissed as an insignificant nuisance sent a shockwave through the galaxy that no amount of propaganda could entirely suppress. For the first time in decades, ordinary citizens across 1,000 worlds allowed themselves to wonder, quietly and carefully whether the empire they had come to fear as permanent and unassailable might, in fact, possess weaknesses after all. He did not react to this catastrophe with the panic a lesser strategist might have shown. Instead, true to the patience that had defined his entire life, he turned his attention toward understanding exactly who had accomplished what should have been impossible, and it was in that investigation that he first learned the name of the young man who had fired the shot that destroyed his weapon, a name that, when paired with certain details of his origin and the reports of an unusually strong connection to the Force displayed during the attack, began to suggest a possibility he had never seriously considered, that the bloodline he believed he had eliminated decades earlier, when he engineered the fall of his own apprentice's greatest love, might not have ended as completely as he had assumed. The years that followed the destruction of his greatest weapon were marked by an intensified, almost obsessive campaign to crush the growing rebellion before it could gather enough strength to threaten his empire in any lasting way. He redirected enormous resources toward hunting down the scattered rebel fleet, toward tightening his grip on wavering systems that had begun to question the Empire's supposed invincibility, and toward the construction of an even larger and more devastating successor to the weapon he had lost, determined not merely to replace what had been destroyed, but to demonstrate, through an even greater display of destructive power, that the setback had been nothing more than a minor and easily corrected inconvenience. But his true attention, increasingly, turned toward the young man whose growing legend had begun to spread among both the rebellion and the wider galaxy. A pilot whose instinctive skill in the Force suggested training, whether formal or accidental, that could not simply be dismissed as beginner's luck. He suspected, correctly, that this young man's connection to the Force was no coincidence, and as reports continued to accumulate describing further encounters between the rebellion's rising hero and his own apprentice, encounters in which the young man displayed abilities and resilience that seemed to grow with each confrontation, the Dark Lord began to formulate a new and far more ambitious strategy, one that would ultimately prove to be the most consequential miscalculation of his entire life. His apprentice, during a brutal confrontation high above a frozen and remote world, where the rebellion had established a hidden base, discovered the truth that the Dark Lord himself had already begun to suspect, that the young man was not merely a gifted, self-taught Force user, but his own son. Born of a secret marriage the Dark Lord had orchestrated the collapse of decades earlier, a child hidden away and raised in obscurity precisely to protect him from the kind of manipulation and corruption that had defined his father's own fall from grace. This revelation, delivered by the apprentice himself, in a moment of brutal honesty, meant to break the young man's resolve. Instead, sent him fleeing in horror and confusion, refusing to accept a truth that threatened to unravel everything he believed about his own identity and his place in the galaxy's unfolding struggle. For the Dark Lord, this discovery presented an opportunity too tempting to ignore. He had spent his entire life believing that raw power, properly cultivated and shaped by hardship and betrayal, could conquer any obstacle. And in his son, he now recognized the possibility of an apprentice whose natural gifts might, if properly directed, surpass even the considerable power of his current servant. He began to consider, with the same patient calculation that had guided every major decision of his long and ruthless career, a plan to either convert the young man to the dark side or should that prove impossible, to eliminate him entirely rather than allow such formidable potential to remain a threat to his empire. He instructed his apprentice to bring the young man before him, not as a prisoner to be executed, but as a potential recruit whose loyalty, once secured, could reshape the very foundation of Sith power for generations to come. His apprentice, however, harbored ambitions of his own in this matter, quietly hoping to turn his son to his side, not merely to serve the Empire, but to eventually help him overthrow the very master who had spent years subjecting him to fear and humiliation, a secret hope that revealed just how incomplete the Dark Lord's control over his servant's inner will truly remained, despite decades of careful conditioning. This hidden agenda would eventually bring father and son together in a final, decisive confrontation, one that the Dark Lord watched unfold with growing anticipation, confident that whatever the outcome, the result would ultimately serve his own ambitions, whether through the corruption of a powerful new apprentice or the elimination of the last remaining threat to his absolute rule. The confrontation, when it finally came, took place not in secrecy, but in the full and calculated theater of his own design, staged aboard his newly constructed weapon of mass destruction as it neared completion above a heavily forested moon, a location chosen specifically because it allowed him to personally oversee both the final defeat of the rebellion's last desperate assault and the ultimate resolution of his long campaign to secure his son's loyalty, or, failing that, his death. He arranged the entire confrontation as a trap of extraordinary scope, allowing intelligence about his weapon's vulnerabilities to reach the rebellion through channels he controlled, luring their entire remaining fleet into a final, climactic battle he was certain would end not merely in military victory, but in the complete and permanent eradication of any lingering hope for resistance against his empire. When his son was finally brought before him, escorted by the apprentice whose loyalty had, unbeknownst to the Dark Lord, already begun to fracture beneath the weight of a father's forgotten love, rekindled by his own child's unwavering compassion, the Dark Lord allowed himself, for the first time in decades, to indulge in something resembling genuine anticipation. He spoke to the young man not with the cold detachment he reserved for enemies, but with something that almost resembled warmth, offering him the same seductive promises of power and purpose that had once drawn his own father into darkness, painting the path of the dark side not as corruption but as liberation, the natural and inevitable fulfillment of potential too great to be constrained by the limiting philosophy of the Jedi. He watched with satisfaction as his words seemed to stir something within the young man, a flicker of anger, of temptation that he was certain would eventually blossom into full and willing submission. But the young man refused, again and again, to strike down his own father in anger, despite every provocation the Dark Lord offered, refusing even when informed that his sister, the twin he had only recently discovered, would become the next target of imperial corruption should he continue to resist. In that refusal, the Dark Lord witnessed something he had not encountered in decades of manipulating and destroying everyone who crossed his path. A will that could not be broken through fear, anger, or the promise of power. A compassion so absolute that it refused to yield even under the threat of losing everything the young man held dear. Frustrated and increasingly convinced that persuasion alone would never succeed, the Dark Lord made the decision that would ultimately prove to be his final and most fatal miscalculation. He turned his full and terrible power directly upon the young man, unleashing streams of raw, destructive energy meant to end his life entirely, confident that even if he could not corrupt his son, he could at least eliminate the threat his son's compassion and resistance represented. It was in that moment, as his son writhed in agony beneath an onslaught of lightning that few beings in galactic history had ever survived, that the apprentice, standing witness to a suffering he recognized with sudden, overwhelming clarity as a mirror of his own decades of pain, finally broke free of the fear and conditioning that had bound him for so long. In an act that required drawing upon whatever fragment of his old self had survived years of deliberate suppression and psychological torment, the apprentice seized his master and hurled him bodily into the depths of the very weapon he had helped construct, ending in a single desperate act of paternal love finally reclaimed the reign of the most patient and ruthless Sith Lord the galaxy had seen in 1,000 years. The Dark Lord's final scream, as he fell, echoed with a fury and disbelief that betrayed, for the first time in his long and calculated life, the complete failure of his ability to anticipate every possible outcome. He had spent decades ensuring that no one could ever surprise him. And in the end, it was precisely the compassion he had always dismissed as weakness that undid every plan he had ever carefully constructed. Yet even in that fall, in the physical destruction of the body that had carried him from a quiet, unremarkable childhood on a peaceful world to the absolute mastery of an entire galaxy, the story of his ambition did not end quite as cleanly as those who witnessed his death believed. For decades, hidden even from the apprentice who ultimately destroyed him, he had prepared against precisely this possibility, understanding with the same paranoid foresight that had defined every aspect of his rise to power, that even a Dark Lord as powerful as himself could not entirely rule out the possibility of a violent and unexpected end. Long before his final confrontation with his son, he had begun quietly cultivating knowledge and resources dedicated to a single, audacious goal: the conquest of death itself, a goal his own first master had pursued through decades of scientific research into the manipulation of life at its most fundamental level, and which he, unlike that master, had found a way to at least partially achieve. On a remote and shrouded world deep within territory his empire had never officially acknowledged controlling. Hidden from the eyes of even his most trusted officers, he had established a secret facility dedicated to the cultivation of cloned bodies, vessels grown and maintained in readiness for a consciousness that might, under the right circumstances and through rituals of dark side sorcery, passed down across centuries of secret Sith tradition, be transferred from a dying or destroyed body into a fresh and waiting host. It was knowledge drawn from ancient practices predating even the 1,000-year exile that had once driven the Sith into hiding. Rituals that promised not true immortality but something close enough to serve his purposes. The ability to cheat death by fleeing one failing vessel for another. Again and again, indefinitely, so long as the ritual could be properly performed and a suitable clone body remained available to receive him. In the instant of his fall, as his physical form was consumed by the devastating power he had unleashed upon his own son, and then, in a final irony, could not withstand himself, his spirit did not simply dissipate into the endless currents of the Force the way ordinary beings' consciousnesses eventually do. Drawing upon decades of preparation, and a mastery of dark side technique that few in galactic history had ever equaled, he wrenched his essence free of his dying body in the final moments before its destruction, casting his consciousness out into the raw currents of the Force itself, adrift and disembodied, but not, crucially, extinguished. It was an act of will so absolute, so thoroughly practiced through years of secret ritual and preparation, that even the devastating destruction of the great battle station and the death of his physical form in its explosion could not fully sever the thread of his continued existence. For a time, his consciousness drifted formless through what practitioners of the deepest and darkest Force traditions called the Netherworld, a shadowed, liminal space between true death and physical life, where spirits of extraordinary power, dark side and light alike, could linger in a kind of suspended existence, retaining awareness and will but lacking any physical vessel through which to act upon the galaxy of the living. It was a state few beings could endure without eventually dissolving into the greater currents of the Force entirely. And it was only through the sheer, obsessive strength of his hatred and ambition, emotions that had defined and sustained him since the earliest days of his corruption, that he managed to hold his fragmented consciousness together long enough to seek out the clone vessels he had so carefully prepared in the years before his death. The transfer, when it finally occurred, was neither immediate nor without cost. Clone bodies, however carefully grown and maintained, were imperfect vessels for a consciousness as powerful and corrupted as his, and the earliest attempts at reoccupying a physical form met with only partial and unstable success, producing bodies that could sustain his consciousness for only limited periods before beginning to break down under the strain of housing a spirit steeped so deeply in the dark side. It would take repeated attempts, repeated failures, and repeated deaths and rebirths across a series of clone bodies before he finally achieved a stable enough vessel to reassert his will upon the wider galaxy in any meaningful way. A process that consumed years, during which the empire he had built began to fracture and crumble in his prolonged absence, its regional governors and military commanders turning against one another in a desperate scramble to fill the vacuum of leadership left by his apparent death. He watched this unraveling with a mixture of fury and grim satisfaction from his hidden sanctuary, understanding that the chaos consuming his former empire, while frustrating in its erosion of the power structure he had spent a lifetime building, also served to obscure his own quiet efforts at resurrection from anyone who might otherwise have gone looking for signs of his survival. Few among the fractured remnants of his imperial government seriously entertained the possibility that their fallen emperor might yet return, and this widespread assumption of his permanent death allowed him the freedom to work in secrecy, refining his clone vessels and gathering resources for what he intended to be, not merely a return to power, but a return more absolute and more terrible than anything the galaxy had experienced, even during the height of his original reign. When he finally emerged from hiding, years after his apparent destruction above the forested moon, he did so with a fleet and an arsenal that dwarfed even the might of his original empire at its peak. Having spent the intervening years secretly directing loyal remnants of his former military infrastructure toward the construction of weapons and technologies more devastating than anything the galaxy had previously witnessed, his return sent shockwaves through a fledgling new government that had only recently begun rebuilding from the ashes of decades of imperial rule. A coalition of former rebels and liberated systems attempting, with considerable difficulty, to establish something resembling the democratic institutions the old republic had once represented, before he spent a lifetime dismantling them from within. His resurrection also brought him back into direct and immediate conflict with the son, whose refusal to strike him down in anger had once, briefly, seemed to mark the definitive end of his ambitions. The young man, now grown into one of the most powerful practitioners of the Force the galaxy had seen since the height of the old Jedi Order, found himself once again drawn into a confrontation with the figure who had shaped so much of his family's tragic history. Though this time the stakes had grown even more personal and more dangerous. The clone bodies that housed his resurrected consciousness carried within them an unintended vulnerability, a genetic instability that meant each vessel could sustain his presence for only a limited time before beginning to fail. A weakness that drove him toward increasingly desperate measures as he sought a permanent solution to the fundamental problem that had haunted every Sith who ever attempted to conquer death: that the body, however carefully prepared, remained stubbornly mortal, even when the spirit housed within it refused to accept that limitation. His obsession with permanence led him toward a scheme even more audacious than simple cloning, a plan to transfer his consciousness not into another artificially grown vessel, but into a body of extraordinary natural power, one capable of sustaining his essence indefinitely without the genetic decay that plagued his clone hosts. He set his sights in this final and most desperate phase of his long war against mortality upon his own granddaughter, a young woman whose connection to the Force, inherited through the bloodline he had once tried to eliminate and then later sought to corrupt, represented exactly the kind of vessel he believed could finally grant him the true, lasting immortality he had sought since his earliest days as an ambitious young apprentice studying at the feet of a master obsessed with conquering death. The attempt to seize her body and claim it as his own final, permanent vessel represented perhaps the most horrifying single act of his entire existence, a betrayal of family so absolute that it exceeded even the murder of his own parents decades earlier, or the manipulation that had led to his own son's tragic transformation into the very instrument of imperial terror. It was, in its own dark way, a fitting culmination of everything he had always been, a being who saw other people, even those bound to him by blood, as nothing more than resources to be exploited in service of his own boundless hunger for continued existence and power. But this final scheme, like so many of his ambitions before it, ultimately met with failure, thwarted through a combination of his granddaughter's own inner strength, the timely intervention of allies who refused to abandon her, and the same stubborn, unbreakable resistance to corruption that had once defined his son's own refusal to fall, driven back once again into a fragile and unstable clone body. His power diminished, but his hatred undiminished. He made one final, desperate bid to secure the galaxy's total subjugation before his failing vessels could no longer sustain him, unleashing forces and technologies he had kept in reserve throughout his years of hidden resurrection, weapons of such staggering, destructive capability that even his own most loyal remaining commanders began to question whether victory in this final campaign was even the true objective, or whether he intended, in the event of his own final defeat, to ensure that no one else would ever again rule the ruins of what remained. It was the philosophy that had quietly underpinned his entire life, laid bare in its most extreme and nihilistic form. If he could not possess the galaxy eternally, He would ensure that its destruction became his final, permanent legacy, a scorched inheritance left behind for anyone foolish enough to believe they could build something better from what remained. The final confrontation that ended his existence permanently, severing at last the thread of dark side will that had allowed him to persist across multiple bodies and multiple supposed deaths, took place not through simple physical combat, but through a combination of desperate heroism, sacrifice, and the accumulated strength of an entire generation of Force users who had learned, through hard experience, exactly what it took to resist the seductive promises he had once used to corrupt so many before them. His son, his granddaughter, and the scattered allies who had spent years fighting against the shadow of his resurrected empire converged in that final battle, drawing upon reserves of strength, unity, and sacrifice that stood in direct and deliberate opposition to everything he had ever represented. Division, fear, and the total subjugation of others in service of a single, insatiable will to power. In the end, it was not merely superior force that finally destroyed him, but the accumulated weight of every relationship he had ever betrayed, every family he had ever torn apart, and every act of compassion he had ever dismissed as weakness, returning to him in a final reckoning that his considerable power, even amplified across generations of stolen life and stolen bodies, could not withstand. His consciousness, unable this time to find a stable vessel through which to continue clinging to existence, finally dissolved into the Force itself, not as the triumphant, eternal godhood he had spent a lifetime seeking, but as a final, complete unmaking, the absolute end of a will that had spent the better part of a century sowing destruction, betrayal, and suffering across an entire galaxy in pursuit of a power that, in the final accounting, proved incapable of purchasing him the one thing he had always feared losing most: his own continued existence. What remained, in the long aftermath of his final defeat, was not a legacy of unchallenged mastery, but a cautionary history studied and retold across generations. The story of a quiet, unremarkable boy from a peaceful world who allowed ambition, resentment, and the seductive promise of power to consume every relationship, every conscience, and ultimately every fragment of the person he might otherwise have become. His empire, built across decades of patient betrayal and sustained through fear rather than genuine loyalty, crumbled into fragments almost as soon as his guiding will was permanently removed from the galaxy's affairs, proof that even the most meticulously engineered tyranny ultimately depends on something far more fragile than its architect ever wished to admit. The galaxy he had once bent so completely to his will, slowly, painfully, began rebuilding itself around principles he had spent his entire life working to destroy. Cooperation over domination, compassion over fear, and the fragile, hard-won understanding that no single will, however patient or however powerful, could ever truly conquer the countless individual choices, sacrifices, and acts of quiet resistance that, together, proved far stronger in the end than even the darkest and most carefully cultivated ambition the galaxy had ever known. To fully understand the magnitude of what was lost and what was ultimately overcome in that final confrontation, it helps to look more closely at the years between his first fall and his eventual permanent unmaking. Years during which the galaxy experienced both the fragile hope of liberation and the renewed terror of his return, a cycle that revealed just how deeply his decades of calculated cruelty had embedded themselves into the very structure of galactic power. In the immediate aftermath of his apparent death above the forested moon, the coalition of rebels who had fought so desperately to bring down his empire found themselves facing a challenge almost as daunting as the war itself: the task of dismantling a governmental and military apparatus built entirely around dependence on a single, absolute authority. Without him, without the singular will that had held together decades of fear-based loyalty and centralized control, his empire did not simply surrender or dissolve peacefully. Instead, it fractured into competing factions, each led by ambitious officers and governors who had spent years learning, under his tutelage, that power belonged to whoever was ruthless enough to seize and hold it. This fragmentation created a galaxy racked by continued, smaller-scale conflicts, even as the fledgling new government worked to establish legitimate authority and rebuild the democratic institutions his decades of manipulation had systematically destroyed. Warlords carved out private fiefdoms from the wreckage of his once unified empire, each claiming to be his rightful successor, each employing variations of the same tactics of fear and control he had perfected during his long rise to power. It was, in its own tragic way, a testament to just how thoroughly he had reshaped an entire generation of military and political leadership in his own image, ensuring that even in his physical absence, the philosophy of domination and betrayal he had cultivated across decades continued to poison the galaxy's slow and difficult path toward peace. Amid this chaos, his son struggled with his own complicated legacy, torn between his relief at having finally broken free of the darkness that had consumed his life for so many years, and the profound grief of having lost, in that same moment of liberation, the father whose redemption he had fought so hard to achieve. He spent the years following the destruction of the second great battle station, attempting to rebuild something of the Jedi Order his father had helped destroy decades earlier, traveling to distant and half-forgotten corners of the galaxy in search of ancient knowledge, forgotten temples, and any surviving fragments of the wisdom that had once guided generations of Jedi before the purge that nearly erased their order from history entirely. It was slow, uncertain work, complicated further by the fact that no formal Jedi training had been passed down in any organized fashion for decades, leaving him to reconstruct an entire philosophical and spiritual tradition, largely from fragments, old texts, and half-remembered lessons imparted by teachers who themselves had died before completing his own education. It was during these years of quiet rebuilding that the first signs of his father's continued hidden existence began to surface, though neither the son nor the fragile new government yet understood the full scope of what those signs represented. Reports trickled in from the outer territories describing strange, coordinated movements among remnant imperial forces, evidence of resources and technology being funneled toward a destination that intelligence analysts working for the new government could not initially identify, and whispered rumors, dismissed at first as superstition or wishful thinking among loyalists who refused to accept that their emperor was truly gone, that the dark side itself seemed to be stirring again somewhere at the edges of known space. The scale of what he had prepared during his years in hiding, once finally revealed, defied even the most pessimistic estimates offered by those tasked with assessing the lingering threat of his former empire. He had used the years of his physical absence not merely to stabilize his own resurrected form, but to construct, in near total secrecy, an entirely new generation of military technology, including massive constructs capable of consuming entire planets for their raw materials, converting the harvested resources directly into new warships and weapons at a pace that dwarfed even the industrial capacity his original empire had commanded at its height. It was an operation of staggering ambition, one that revealed with terrible clarity just how little the destruction of his physical body years earlier had actually diminished the scope of his long-term planning, patience being, as it always had been, the one resource he possessed in seemingly inexhaustible supply. When he finally revealed himself to the wider galaxy, emerging from the shadows, to reclaim the throne he had never truly relinquished in his own mind, the psychological impact on a population that had only just begun to believe genuine peace and self-governance might be possible proved almost as devastating as the military threat he now posed. Entire systems that had spent years cautiously rebuilding their own local governments, tentatively trusting the promises of the new galactic coalition, found themselves gripped once again by the paralyzing fear that had defined so much of his original reign. A fear made all the more potent by the almost supernatural horror of his apparent return from the dead, a resurrection that many across the galaxy, lacking any real understanding of the dark side rituals that made it possible, interpreted as proof of a kind of terrible, invincible divinity. His son, upon learning of his father's return, faced an agonizing choice that echoed, in inverted form, the very temptation he had resisted years earlier in his father's original throne room, where he had once refused to strike down his father in anger. Now he found himself confronting the question of whether some fragment of the darkness that had once consumed his father as Vader might still exist within this resurrected form. Whether redemption, once achieved even briefly in a father's final act of love, could somehow be reclaimed a second time, or whether this version of his father, driven by decades of unrestrained hatred and an all-consuming hunger to conquer death itself, represented something that had moved entirely beyond any possibility of redemption. It was a question that would come to define much of the son's own inner struggle throughout the crisis of his father's return. A struggle complicated further by his own growing awareness of a new and unexpected variable in the equation. A young woman, unrelated by blood to his own family, whose extraordinary natural connection to the Force had drawn her, almost against her will, into the center of the unfolding conflict. Her presence in this final chapter of the story added a dimension that even the resurrected Dark Lord, for all his careful planning and decades of accumulated experience in manipulating the ambitions and fears of others, had not fully anticipated when he began his desperate search for a permanent vessel to house his consciousness. Trained in secret, hidden from the wider galaxy for her own protection by allies who understood the danger her unusual strength in the Force represented, she grew into her power with a combination of natural talent and hard-won discipline that increasingly reminded those who trained her of the very qualities that had once defined the most legendary Jedi of earlier generations. When the Dark Lord finally set his sights upon her as the vessel through which he intended to achieve true and lasting immortality, he did so believing, as he had believed throughout his entire long and manipulative life, that raw power and careful strategy would ultimately prove sufficient to overcome any resistance she might offer. He underestimated her, just as he had once underestimated his own son decades earlier, mistaking her youth and relative inexperience for weakness, rather than recognizing, until it was far too late, the same unbreakable core of compassion and moral conviction that had already once before proven immune to every temptation and threat he could offer. Their confrontation, when it finally came, unfolded across a landscape steeped in the very earliest history of the Sith tradition itself, an ancient and desolate world where the ruins of long-dead Dark Lords stood as silent testimony to just how many powerful and ambitious beings had, across 1,000 years of galactic history, ultimately failed to achieve the singular, permanent dominance he had spent his entire existence pursuing. It was a fitting stage for the final chapter of his story, a graveyard of Sith ambition that would soon claim one more name among its countless, forgotten dead. The battle that unfolded there drew upon strength gathered not merely from the two combatants directly involved, but from the accumulated will and sacrifice of generations who had come before them, both light and dark. A convergence of history and legacy that reflected, in its own way, the central truth his entire philosophy had always refused to acknowledge: that no being, however powerful or however patient, truly acts alone. That every choice ripples outward across countless other lives, and that the compassion and unity he had spent a lifetime dismissing as weakness ultimately proved to be the one force in the galaxy capable of resisting and finally overcoming the absolute, isolating hunger for power that had defined his entire existence from the moment a hidden Sith Lord first recognized potential in a quiet, unhappy boy on a peaceful world so many decades before. When his consciousness finally dissolved beyond any possibility of further resurrection, scattered at last into the vast and indifferent currents of the Force itself, it marked the true and final end of a story that had begun with a single act of childhood cruelty and grown, across decades of patient manipulation, into a shadow that had touched nearly every corner of galactic history. He had sought, above all else, to conquer death itself, to achieve a permanence that no other being in the long history of the Sith had ever truly managed to secure. And, in the end, that very obsession, that refusal to accept the fundamental impermanence that governs all living things, proved to be the flaw that undid him more completely than any single enemy or any single act of betrayal ever could. He was remembered in the centuries that followed, not as the eternal God Emperor he had once envisioned himself becoming, but as a cautionary figure, a reminder of exactly how far unchecked ambition, patience weaponized in service of cruelty, and a fundamental contempt for the value of other beings' lives could ultimately carry a single, determined mind, and of how, even against odds that must have seemed insurmountable, at every turn, compassion, sacrifice, and the quiet, stubborn refusal to give in to fear ultimately proved strong enough to bring even the most patient and powerful tyrant the galaxy had ever known to his final and permanent end. Looking back across the full arc of his life, from a manipulative child on a peaceful world to a Dark Lord whose ambition ultimately spanned death itself, certain patterns emerge that help explain not merely what he did, but why his particular brand of evil proved so devastatingly effective for so long. Unlike many of the tyrants and conquerors who preceded him across galactic history, he never relied primarily on brute force or open terror to secure his power, at least not in the earliest and most crucial decades of his rise. He understood, with an insight that few of his contemporaries, Jedi or otherwise, ever fully appreciated until it was far too late, that the most durable forms of power are those built to appear voluntary, structures of control disguised so thoroughly as protection, reform, or necessity that the very people being subjugated come to believe they are choosing their own chains freely. This was the genius and the horror of his methodology. He did not conquer the Republic so much as convince it to conquer itself, exploiting every crack of division and dysfunction that already existed within its institutions, rather than attempting to impose control from entirely outside them. This same pattern repeated itself throughout every major phase of his life. He did not simply murder his family. He was tested and shaped into someone who could rationalize that murder as a necessary act of transformation, a threshold to be crossed rather than a crime to be regretted. He did not simply seize the chancellorship through force. He engineered a crisis specifically designed to make his ascension appear to be the reluctant will of a desperate and frightened populace. He did not simply destroy the Jedi Order through open military assault. He spent years cultivating the very instrument of their destruction from within their own ranks, corrupting one of their most promising knights so thoroughly that the betrayal, when it finally came, could never have been anticipated by an order trained specifically to sense danger and deception. Every major achievement of his long and terrible career followed this same fundamental logic. Identify a system's inherent vulnerabilities, patiently cultivate the conditions that would allow those vulnerabilities to be exploited, and then, at the precise moment of maximum advantage, strike with a decisiveness that left his enemies no time to organize an effective response. It is worth pausing to consider, too, the peculiar psychology that allowed him to sustain such extraordinary patience across decades of scheming without ever betraying to those around him the true depth of his ambitions. Where many who seek absolute power eventually succumb to impatience, revealing their true intentions too early through some careless slip of arrogance or overreach. He demonstrated a discipline that bordered on the inhuman, maintaining his carefully constructed public persona for the better part of a lifetime without a single significant lapse. This discipline was not, as some who studied his life later concluded, evidence of some deeper wisdom or genuine restraint. It reflected instead the totality of his corruption, a mind so thoroughly reshaped by the dark side philosophy instilled in him from adolescence that patience itself became simply another tool in service of an appetite for power that recognized no natural limit and required no external validation to sustain itself across decades of quiet, methodical work. His relationship with his own apprentices, first as the student who ultimately betrayed and destroyed his own teacher, and later as the master who cultivated and then discarded his own students' humanity with casual, calculated cruelty, reveals perhaps the clearest window into the fundamental emptiness at the core of his character. He was capable, when it served his purposes, of performing something that resembled warmth, mentorship, even a kind of twisted affection, as he demonstrated during his careful, patient cultivation of the young Jedi. He would eventually corrupt into his most devoted servant. But this performance, however convincing it appeared to those on the receiving end of it, never reflected any genuine investment in another being's well-being. It was, from beginning to end, purely instrumental, a means of securing loyalty and utility from someone whose value, in his calculation, existed entirely in relation to how effectively they could be deployed in service of his own ambitions. The moment that utility diminished, whether through failure, disobedience, or simple obsolescence. The warmth vanished instantly, replaced by contempt, punishment, or outright abandonment. This pattern of instrumentalizing every relationship he ever formed extended even to his treatment of his own homeworld, the very planet whose invasion he orchestrated purely to advance his own political ambitions, subjecting the people among whom he had been born and raised to occupation and suffering without a flicker of hesitation or remorse. It extended to his manipulation of an entire galaxy's population during the war he secretly orchestrated on both sides simultaneously, a conflict that claimed countless lives across 1,000 worlds purely to provide him with the political cover and emergency authority he required to complete his transformation of the Republic into an empire. And it extended, in its most intimate and devastating form, to his manipulation of his own son's deepest fears and attachments, exploiting a young man's love for the people closest to him, not to help him protect that love, but to weaponize it, turning compassion itself into the very instrument of his corruption. And yet, for all the calculated brilliance of his methods, his story ultimately stands as a study not merely in the mechanics of tyranny, but in the profound limitations of a worldview built entirely around domination and control. He never seemed to grasp, across the full span of his long and terrible existence, that the very qualities he dismissed as weakness, love, compassion, loyalty freely given rather than coerced through fear, represented not vulnerabilities to be exploited, but genuine sources of strength, that his own philosophy left him permanently unable to access or understand. He built an empire of unprecedented scale and power, and yet he died, ultimately alone, having systematically destroyed or betrayed every meaningful relationship he had ever formed across his long and calculating life, surrounded in his final moments, not by allies bound to him through genuine loyalty, but by subordinates whose obedience had always been rooted in fear rather than affection, a fear that evaporated the instant his power to enforce it was finally permanently broken. The generations that came after him, those who inherited a galaxy shaped so profoundly by the consequences of his ambition, would spend decades grappling with the legacy he left behind, working to rebuild institutions he had spent a lifetime dismantling, and to heal divisions he had deliberately cultivated and exploited for his own benefit. His name became, across the wider galaxy, a byword for a particular kind of evil, one defined less by dramatic villainy than by patient, methodical betrayal, the quiet, incremental corruption of institutions and relationships that most people, most of the time, simply trusted to operate in good faith. It was, perhaps, the most enduring lesson of his entire life, that the greatest threats to freedom and stability rarely announce themselves through open conquest or obvious cruelty, but instead work slowly, patiently, and almost invisibly, exploiting exactly the kind of complacency and trust that allows any healthy system, whether political, personal, or spiritual, to function in the first place. In the end, the story of his rise and fall serves as both a warning and, perhaps, a strange kind of reassurance. A warning, because it demonstrates with terrible clarity just how far patient, calculated ambition can travel when left unchecked by vigilance, transparency, and a willingness to question even those figures who present themselves as reasonable, moderate, and trustworthy. And a reassurance, because for all the devastation he wrought across decades of careful scheming, and unimaginable cruelty. His ultimate defeat came not through some equally ruthless counter-strategy, but through the very qualities he had spent his entire existence trying to eliminate: love that refused to calculate its own advantage, compassion that persisted even in the face of overwhelming provocation, and the quiet, stubborn conviction, held by an ever-widening circle of people across multiple generations, that no accumulation of power, however vast, could ever truly extinguish the fundamental worth of another living being. It was this conviction, more than any weapon or any military strategy, that finally and permanently ended the reign of the most patient, most calculating, and most dangerous Dark Lord the galaxy had known in 1,000 years of Sith history, closing at last a chapter that had begun so quietly, so many decades earlier, with nothing more than an unhappy boy on a peaceful, unassuming world, watched from the shadows by a master who saw in him not a child worth protecting, but merely a vessel worth shaping into something else entirely. There is one final thread worth drawing out before this story reaches its true close. A thread concerning the strange, almost mythic status his name eventually acquired across the galaxy long after his final, permanent death. In the decades and centuries that followed, historians, storytellers, and ordinary citizens alike struggled to fully comprehend how a single individual, born without any particular military force or inherited authority behind him, had managed to bring an entire galaxy to its knees through patience and manipulation alone. Some chose to remember him as something almost supernatural, a figure whose mastery of the dark side elevated him beyond ordinary categories of villainy into something closer to a force of nature, an explanation that, while comforting in its way, tended to obscure the more uncomfortable truth of his rise, that he succeeded not because he possessed powers beyond human understanding, but because the institutions meant to prevent exactly the kind of concentrated, unaccountable power he sought were, through complacency, division, and a stubborn unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths, simply unprepared to stop him. Others, particularly those who studied the fall of the Jedi Order in the years following his death, came to see his story as a mirror held up to the failures of an institution that had grown too confident in its own righteousness, too insulated from the consequences of its own blind spots, to recognize the danger patiently accumulating in plain sight for the better part of a century. The Jedi, for all their wisdom and genuine commitment to peace, had allowed themselves to believe that vigilance against the dark side was primarily a matter of individual discipline and meditation, rather than recognizing that an enemy patient enough could hide in plain sight for generations, cultivating exactly the kind of institutional complacency that made their eventual downfall not merely possible, but, in hindsight, almost inevitable. It was a lesson that outlasted his own physical existence by centuries. Studied and debated long after the empire he built had crumbled into fragments, and the very memory of his rule had faded into the distant, half-legendary past. And so his story, in its fullest telling, from a quiet and unhappy childhood on a world known for peace and beauty, through decades of patient betrayal, manipulation, and calculated cruelty, to a final, desperate refusal to accept even death itself as a natural limit on his ambition, stands as one of the most complete and cautionary arcs in the long history of the galaxy, a reminder carried forward across generations that the greatest dangers rarely arrive announced by trumpets or marching armies, but instead creep in quietly through the slow erosion of trust, the patient exploitation of division, and the seductive, endlessly repeated promise that just a little more power, freely surrendered, will finally bring the safety and order that fear alone can never truly provide.